He could not receive messages, but he could transmit, and his artillery spotters began to set up coordinates for fire from the 155mm guns back on Torokina. The guns responded, great splashes of dirt and greenery rose up from the jungle, and the marine situation took a turn for the better. It improved more when strafing planes came zooming down over the area and fired into the jungle. At 6 o'clock that night, the destroyers Fulham, Lansdowne and Lardner appeared off the beach and began shelling the Japanese, covering the right and left flanks of the beachhead. With this firing at 7:20 p.m. that night, the landing craft were able to get to shore. The night was pitch black, and under this cover the Marines moved into the water and the boats. But in the darkness, much of the equipment of the detachment was missed or had to be abandoned. There was no help for it. The Marines had to get going, and by 8:40 p.m. they were in the boats and moving out to sea under the covering fire of the destroyers. 17 Marines had been killed or received mortal wounds, and 95 were wounded. When they came back to Torokina, they claimed to have killed 145 Japanese, but there is no way this could be substantiated, and the figure is undoubtedly exaggerated. The mission was a complete failure. The members of the detachment were lucky to get out with their skins. It was a good lesson that the Japanese were still very much alive in central Bougainville. Admiral Halsey was moving faster now, and in the middle of November the pace of the air war stepped up. Guadalcanal was now a rear area. The American planes came from Mundar on New Georgia Island and from Baracoma on Vella La Vella, and they ranged up and down Bougainville, strafing and bombing. The bombers from the various Central Solomons airfields could now reach Rabaul, but the range was still too great for the fighter planes. So Halsey pushed the work on the fighter strip down by the Torokina beach even harder. The Japanese effort also continued, and that beach at Torokina was hit night after night. More anti-aircraft guns were brought up to Bougainville, and they paid their way in knocking down the Japanese nightbirds, but they did not stop Japanese air activity. By November 24, Rabaul's air force was building again, despite constant raids by B-24s and B-25s. Scout planes counted more than 200 Japanese planes on the Rabaul airfields. The Americans continued to resupply the Bougainville beach with big convoys, and the Japanese continued to attack them. The combination of American fighters and anti-aircraft gunners aboard the ships kept damage to a minimum, and many Japanese planes were shot down. 3 weeks after the invasion of Bougainville, the Japanese command at Rabaul was still not convinced that this move into Torokina represented the major American effort on the island. The move was completely unorthodox. Major Japanese bases existed on the north end, Buka and the south end, Buen and the Shortlands, and it seemed unreasonable that the Americans would not seek to capture at least one of these. West-central Bougainville, where they had landed, did not even have a decent harbour. So, even though the Japanese army on the island outnumbered the original landing force of 34,000 by almost 2-1, the Japanese chose to build up the northern and southern bases for the expected attack, instead of pitting their major effort against the Torokina landings. On November 24, the Pearl Harbor radio intelligence team intercepted messages between Rabaul and Truk concerning a new supply and reinforcement mission for Buka, the site of major air bases. The Navy was to send 3 destroyer transports with 2 protective destroyers down to the Buka Passage, with 925 troops and 35 tons of food and ammunition. They were to take off 700 incapacitated sailors and soldiers for return to Rabaul. The date was to be November 24. The destroyers were to sail at 3:30 in the afternoon, Tokyo time. Commander of the mission would be Captain Kyoto Kagawa in the Onami, a 2,000-ton ship about a year old. With him for protection would be the Minami, another ship of the same class. To be protected were the 3 older destroyers, Yugiri, Amagiri and Uzuki, which would be carrying the troops and supplies. All 3 destroyers and their crews were veterans of the slot. The Amagiri had been making such runs to Kolombangara for months. The Uzuki had been in these waters since the Guadalcanal days. She had been through Admiral Tanaka's Guadalcanal resupply battles. The Yugiri had been involved in one of the earliest successful American air attacks on Japanese warships. August 28, 1942, when United States bombers completely stopped a Guadalcanal resupply mission, sank the destroyer Asagiri and caused such damage to the Yugiri that her whole superstructure had to be rebuilt at Truk. When Admiral Halsey received that ultra message about the coming Japanese supply run, his staff moved to act quickly. On November 24, Captain Arleigh Burke's Destroyer Squadron 23 was refuelling at Hathorn Sound when a message came addressed to 31-knot Burke from Halsey. The United States Navy loves meaningful nicknames, and Burke had gotten his from his habit of travelling in enemy waters at top speed. Just as his destroyer squadron had earned the name the Little Beavers, because of an unusual willingness to take on all sorts of jobs not sought by destroyer outfits, such as transporting troops and doing them swiftly and well without complaint. On this day, Burke's message from Halsey had the ring of a message that Admiral Lord Nelson might have sent one of his captains. Put your squadron athwart the Buka-Rabaul evacuation line about 35 miles west of Buka. If enemy contacted, you know what to do. Halsey. The operating ships of Burke's squadron that day were the flagship Charles F. Osborne the Claxton, and the Dyson, all of Division 45, and the Converse and Spence of Division 46. Commanding the 2nd Division was Commander B. L. Austin, and Burke himself led Division 45. At Rabaul, all went according to plan. The troops and supplies were loaded, and the Japanese ships set out for the relatively short trip to Buka. This same voyage had been made a few weeks earlier without opposition, but times had changed drastically in those few weeks. The Japanese had then still controlled the air and sea around Buka Passage. The Americans raided, but the raids were brief and dangerous for the attackers. Now, in November, the Americans were wresting away that control, and on the night of November 24, 9 of Halsey's PT boats had been sent up to lurk off Buka Passage and make a pass at the destroyer reinforcement team if they came along that way. And as Halsey sent his orders to Captain Burke to find the enemy, he also instructed the Solomons Air Force to give Burke night fighter cover, which meant that Burke had an extra advantage not enjoyed by the destroyer commanders in the days of Guadalcanal. The Japanese convoy steamed on that evening toward Buka, not really expecting trouble. The transport destroyers peeled off and entered Buka Passage, then closed on the shore where they stopped, deposited their troops and supplies, and took on the sick and wounded from the Buka base. Then they began to move out to join the protective destroyers. Just outside, 3 of the United States PT boats observed these actions on their radar screens, but failed to understand the significance. At about midnight, Commander Henry Farrow saw the ships moving, but believed them to be the ships of Captain Burke's force, and so he politely moved inshore to get out of the way. But suddenly, 2 of the ships altered course and headed directly toward the PT boats, something that Burke's destroyers would not be likely to do, and one, the Onami, speeded up and gave the PT boat skippers something of a scare. It ought to have. Onami Captain Kyoto Kagawa was heading toward the pestiferous PT boats, with the intention of cutting as many of them in 2 as possible, in the same fashion that the Amagiri had destroyed PT-109 in the slot. Still, most of the PT skippers believed the problem was one of mistaken identity and did not move to attack, even when 5-inch shells began whistling through the air around them. They evaded the oncoming destroyers by ducking into a rain squall. Only one, PT-64, fired a single torpedo. It missed. Nevertheless, the PT boats served a useful purpose that night, because Commander Farrow radioed the story of his encounter, and Captain Burke's destroyers picked up the message. Burke was moving toward the western approaches to St. George's Channel, which separates New Britain Island, where Rabaul is located, from New Ireland. This was all considered to be Japanese water. From the mouth of the passage, off Cape St. George, the distance to Buka Passage was only about 150 miles. When Burke learned that the PT boats had encountered ships he was sure would be those of his enemy, he began preparations for the attack. Down from 31 knots to 23 went the United States destroyers, so that the South Sea phosphorescence of their wakes would decrease, and they would be less likely to be spotted by aircraft from afar. The destroyers changed course, moving across their assigned patrol area. It was a fine night for American radar and a bad one for Japanese night vision, for the clouds hung low and those rain squalls were all about, breaking the regular horizon of the sea. The clouds just hung there, low in the air, for there was almost no wind. Having already had one encounter with the enemy, and now being on the last leg home to Rabaul, Captain Kagawa was not expecting a destroyer attack. He was, in fact, much more anxious about the slowness of the transport destroyers to join up with the Onami and the Makinami. At 1:40 in the morning, the American destroyers changed course to the north, and this put them on a line that would converge with Captain Kagawa's ships. Just moments later, the radar operators of all three of Burke's Division 45 ships picked up a pair of blips on their screens. The blips were 11 miles away to the east. Captain Burke then ordered his ships to point toward the enemy. The Charles F. Osborne, Claxton and Dyson were leading, with Commander Austin's Converse and Spence a little more than 3 miles behind. According to Burke's battle plan, his 3 ships would attack with torpedoes, then turn to evade enemy torpedoes and reload, whereupon Commander Austin's destroyers would have a clear sea on which to attack. The American ships now sped on toward the enemy, the matter of wakes no longer worrying anybody. The Japanese destroyers moved on serenely, close now to Cape St. George and the protected waters of Rabaul, and Captain Kagawa had absolutely no hint that there was an enemy near. At 1:56, Captain Burke's 3 destroyers were in position, and the calculations were complete. The torpedo men fired 15 torpedoes, and then turned sharply to the right to avoid any incoming torpedoes the enemy might have fired. This was a maneuver that too many American destroyer skippers had forgotten in the past. The torpedoes headed for the Japanese ships about 3 miles away. Captain Kagawa's lookouts saw them, the first indication they had that enemy ships were anywhere about, just 30 seconds before the torpedoes began to hit. It was too late to turn away, and the Onami crewmen watched with horrified fascination as the torpedoes came right at them, and 2 struck the side of their ship. For most of the crewmen of the Onami, the violent explosion that came next was their last experience on Earth. One of those torpedoes obviously found a magazine, and the destroyer exploded in a ball of flame that shot 300 feet in the air and scattered like a giant Roman candle charge. A third torpedo struck the Makinami, and it too must have found some explosives inside the ship, for the Makinami also erupted in explosions and broke in too. But the halves continued to float. Waiting for the torpedoes to hit, the men of the Charles F. Osborne radar crew stayed tense and then saw 3 more blips on the screen. When they called Captain Burke on the bridge, he had stopped waiting. The first explosions were in the air. He issued terse orders to Commander Austin to take his 2nd Division and finish off the enemy destroyers, and then Burke set out in hot pursuit of the next 3 enemy ships. The Amagiri, Yugiri and Uzuki were trying to catch up with the lead destroyers, but they were still 8 miles behind when the Onami and Makinami erupted in balls of fire. Captain Katsumori Yamashiro was in command of the transport destroyers. He decided to make a run for it, north to Rabaul. The problem was that his 3 destroyers were all badly in need of refit and could not make 30 knots. But he was close enough, perhaps 80 miles off Cape St. George and the safety of St. George's Channel. He had a chance. The Japanese destroyers fled at their best speed, but Captain Burke managed to bring his 3 pursuers up to 33 knots and close the gap to 8,000 yards. Suddenly, Burke had the feeling that he ought to get out of the way of something, and he ordered a high-speed turn of 45 degrees to the right, held that course for a minute, and then turned back to his base course. Somebody up there was looking after the Americans this night, for just at the moment that the 3 United States destroyers turned back to the original course, 3 sharp explosions were heard behind them. Torpedoes were detonating in the turbulence of the wakes of the ships. The captain of the Yugiri had slowed long enough for his torpedo men to fire a spread of torpedoes at the pursuing American ships. It was a gallant effort, but it cost the Japanese dearly. For in slowing to fire the torpedoes, the Yugiri fell behind the other Japanese destroyers and into range of the Americans. Captain Burke pursued, and in pursuing ordered his ships to open fire with their forward guns. They did so and began scoring hits on the Yugiri, and they also fired on the other 2 destroyers, but did not do so well. The Uzuki was hit by 1 dud 5-inch shell, and the Amagiri by none at all. But the Yugiri began to take punishment. At 2:30 in the morning, Burke's guns were scoring consistent hits on the tail-end Japanese ship. Not long afterward, a shell destroyed the steering of the Ugiri, and she began to move in circles. Explosions poured up over her new superstructure, and shortly after 3 in the morning, the Ugiri sank. Captain Burke chased the Amagiri and the Uzuki as far as he dared, to within 35 miles of Cape St. George. By that time, the darkness of night was racing toward the dawn, and it might be self-terminatory to be caught in daylight so close to the airfields of Rabaul. Burke broke off the chase and turned south. The Amagiri and the Uzuki sped onward into the safe waters of St. George's Channel. There, Captain Yamashiro sent an urgent message to Rabaul to dispatch assistance for the men in the water from the sinkings of the 3 destroyers lost that night. The Navy hurried to help and dispatched submarines to pick up survivors, but when the waters where the Onami and Makinami were reached, the rescuers found nothing. A few men from the Makinami had been able to get into rafts, and eventually they made the shore and rescue. The Onami had gone down immediately, and only at the site of the sinking of the Yuguri were the rescuers rewarded. The submarine I-177 picked up nearly 300 men from this ship and brought them back to Rabaul. Meanwhile, Captain Burke went back to safer waters, south of Bougainville. When dawn broke, the men of the destroyers began to scan the skies anxiously for aircraft, but they were lucky. When the planes came over, they were American planes, not Japanese. The Burke force had got off scot-free in what was to that point the cleanest and most effective American multi-ship action of the war. Not a man was hurt, not a scratch was administered to an American ship, and 3 Japanese destroyers had gone down. When praised for the action, Captain Burke attributed his squadron's success to a force beyond its control. Whether he meant a supreme being or luck, it was certainly true. Something had put Burke's ships in the right place at the right time. A 15-minute delay in getting to the position where he sighted the Japanese destroyers would have meant missing them, Burke pointed out. Even more subject to speculation is the reason for Burke's sudden decision to change course when in hot pursuit of the Ugiri. He had not seen the ship slow down, nor had he any physical indication that he was coming under attack. Still, he turned and by turning saved his ships from almost certain damage and possible destruction. But attributing the success of Burke's action to luck or the Almighty is an oversimplistic solution. The fact is that in the past few months the American fighting captains had come of age. The United States Navy began the Pacific War with a large number of superannuated destroyers, and skippers and officers virtually unskilled in battle because they had never fought before. Furthermore, what was important in peace was no longer important in war. In the pre-war Navy, one of the quickest ways to oblivion for a naval officer was to risk his ship. It had taken some adjustment and some experience for these professional officers to learn that there were worse things in life than running aground. Despite his modesty, Captain Burke was a superior officer. He was well loved by his men for his earthy ways and his level-handed discipline, and for that indefinable characteristic that arouses superior loyalty. Further than that, Burke was a good student. Undoubtedly, at least part of the reason that he turned to avoid the Ugurt's attack was his realization that it was precisely what the enemy should have done. A hunch he said it was, but a reasoned hunch it must have been. Like Commander Moosbrugger and Admiral Merrill, Captain Burke was one of a new breed. Admiral Halsey was responsible for much of this change in attitude in the South Pacific, as those earlier anecdotes about Burke and Halsey indicated. Now it had all begun to pay off. The Japanese, once so contemptuous of American naval prowess, were staggering under a multiplicity of blows. They blamed everything on American technological prowess, but it was not as simple as that, as Burke's action shows. And as far as Buka was concerned, General Imamura now gave up. He issued orders that no further attempts would be made to resupply or reinforce the Buka garrison from Rabaul. From now on, the responsibility was to be that of General Hukatake's 17th Army, based on Bougainville. For all practical purposes, Captain Burke's successful foray had caused the Japanese to draw the new line of defence at St. George's Channel. Bougainville was still crawling with Japanese soldiers, about 70,000 of them. But except for air support, they were going to have to take care of themselves. That's what Captain Burke and his little beavers had done on the night of Thanksgiving 1943. General Hitoshi Imamura was an intelligent man and a highly experienced officer in His Imperial Japanese Majesty's Army. He had studied in England and later served in the military attaché's office in London. As early as 1917, he had been a member of the all-important Military Affairs Bureau of the War Ministry, which really ran the Japanese army and later the government. He was then one of the important cliques. Some called them arch-conspirators who ran Japan. As for experience, he, above nearly all others, could scarcely claim that he did not understand his enemies. Not only had he served in England, but he had travelled widely in Europe, observing other armies there, and had also served in India as resident Japanese military officer, the equivalent of military attaché. Imamura had hitched his star to the group of men who captured control of the Kwantung Army in Manchuria as a power base, and thereafter his rise was rapid. By 1930, he was a section chief in the Military Affairs Bureau, and the next year he held the same position in the Army General Staff. Then came the requisite period of commanding troops in the field. His command was the 57th Infantry Regiment. From there he went on to run the Narashino Army School, and after 2 years to become a brigade commander, 47th in 1935. By this time he had achieved the rank of Major General. A hitch as Deputy Chief of Staff of the Kwantung Army showed where he stood in the military hierarchy. The year was 1936, the year the Japanese made their plans to carry the war into China. Then came the prestigious job of commanding the Army Infantry School, a division, and finally in 1942, the 23rd Army. When the enormous expansion of Japanese military power across the Pacific brought staggering problems of military administration, General Imamura was advanced to the post of commander of the 8th Area Army. This included everything the Japanese might ever capture, down to Samoa, Australia, and New Zealand. It was fitting that what happened in the South Pacific, whether Japan triumphed or fell, should be in his hands. After the failure of the Hamanui detachment and the counter-landing force to wrest control of the Torokina beachhead from the Allies, the Japanese did virtually nothing for several weeks to carry the war on Bougainville. Meanwhile, the Americans kept landing reinforcements, supplies, and heavy artillery. The major Allied effort by American and New Zealand engineers was to build the airstrips, one down on the beach and two on the uplands. The remainder of the troops on Bougainville were there to protect the airstrip builders. Had the Japanese concentrated their forces on Bougainville, either at the beginning of the invasion or at any time within the 3 or 4 weeks, the outcome of that battle might have been quite different. Actually, Bushima, as the Japanese abbreviated the name, offered the sort of battle conditions where the major American advantages were largely vitiated. Thick jungle made airstrikes of only limited value. The same held true of naval bombardments. If there was a place in the Pacific where manpower and infantry skills, plus artillery, meant the difference, it was this island. Yet General Imamura of the 18th Area Army and General Hyakutake, commander of the Japanese 17th Army, ignored their own advantage of numbers of troops and did not make the major effort that might have driven the Americans from the small area of Bougainville that they held. The reason was disbelief. What General MacArthur was planning was the encirclement of Rabaul, and the only reason for invading Bougainville at all was to establish airfields. That could be done without taking on the thousands of troops to the north around Buka, or to the south around Buin and the Shortlands. Japanese troops on Bougainville still numbered more than 70,000, but only 2,000 or 3,000 of these were anywhere near the Torokina perimeter. The Japanese generals persisted in a belief that the Americans would now move a major effort against either Buan or Buka. Almost all their effort was devoted to improving and extending the defences of these areas. But there was never any possibility of Halsey undertaking such a complex operation in these times. The South Pacific was always known as the shoestring theatre, and so it would remain. While Halsey was moving on Bougainville, Nimitz at Pearl Harbor was directing the investment of the Gilbert Islands, and immediately thereafter planning for the capture of the Marshalls. The Navy war plan had always envisioned a drive across the Central Pacific, and the only reason for the Guadalcanal invasion had been to stop a dangerous Japanese effort to cut Australia and New Zealand out of the Allied camp. But in its way, adversity had become a blessing. By landing in the relatively deserted middle of Bougainville, Halsey had obtained the foothold he wanted, and at a price for the airfields now building that was much cheaper than anyone could have expected in terms of lives and effort. At Truk, Admiral Koga suggested that the Americans might be serious in what they were doing, but the generals were not used to taking instruction from an admiral, and they ignored him. Koga's own efforts persisted. He stripped the rest of his command of first-class aircraft to keep them flowing into Rabaul, and despite constant attrition through warfare with Halsey's Solomon's Air Force and MacArthur's 5th Air Force, Admirals Koga and Kusaka did keep the Japanese 11th Air Fleet constantly in motion. If the number of planes fell below 200 in any one day, immediate effort was made to reinforce the fleet. So ineffectual was the Japanese air war against Bougainville that Admiral Halsey was some time in discovering the importance the enemy attached to it, and the record does not indicate that anyone in the South or Southwest Pacific was cognizant of the most compelling reason for the continuation and blowing up of the Japanese air effort. It was, in a word, political. At home, Japan was beginning for the first time to feel that the war was not going well. The overblown reports of the Roe operation were distributed to the membership of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, whose representatives were then meeting in Tokyo. The report of the great victories, the claim was 4 battleships sunk and 2 left burning, 2 cruisers sunk and 4 sinking in the second battle, was distributed to the conferees, and care was taken that the reports were circulated in Manchuria, Taiwan, the Philippines, Burma, and all the other corners of the Japanese Empire. The Japanese were worried about the coming Cairo Conference of the Allies, and it was for that reason that the great air battle was continued, even when Admiral Koga had to at least suspect that the results were being faked. For the Imperial General Staff felt something must be done to shore up a sinking Japanese morale. In Tokyo, General Soichiro Sanada, one member of the Imperial General Staff, had some private thoughts, which he confined to his diary only. As for what is happening in the South Pacific, pardon me for saying, it is windy. This talk about return to Guadalcanal is idiocy. Malaria and other evils make it totally impossible. The Bougainville battle is having enormous repercussions here. Business is declining. Wheat hoarding has begun, and confusion has begun to hang over market conditions. As the war situation began to worsen, a number of the Japanese leaders recognized the truth of what Admiral Yamamoto had been saying for a long time before his death, that the best that could happen to Japan after Midway was to secure an honorable peace. Thus, Japan's diplomatic and military establishment in the neutral world was on the lookout for favorable signs that might lead to a softening of the tough Allied position that demanded unconditional surrender of the Axis powers. The Bougainville air victories, Tokyo believed, provided just the sort of ammunition that was valuable. From the Japanese embassy in Madrid came the word that the Spanish press had aroused considerable excitement in that city with the reports of the great Japanese victory in the South Pacific. The Spanish government and press were all but members of the Rome-Berlin-Tokyo axis. Further, reported the Japanese embassy, sources in Madrid indicated that Great Britain was showing more and more war weariness, and that the leadership in London was not pleased with attempts by the Americans to draw them into further participation in the Pacific War. Another report in mid-November from the Japanese diplomatic group in Stockholm indicated that while at first the reports of the great Japanese victory were greeted there skeptically, the constant repetition, with no American denials, had brought many people to believe in the Japanese claims. This was useful, Stockholm reported, because it indicated that the antipathy toward Japanese statements on the war was beginning to break down. Even from Bern came favourable comment. The Japanese in Switzerland operated under considerable difficulty, because various American agencies, including the Office of Strategic Services under Allen Dulles, waged an incessant and generally successful campaign to keep Japanese news reports out of the Swiss press. But in spite of all this, the minister to Switzerland reported, the great victories had aroused a reluctant admiration for the Japanese effort, and this could be valuable. So in December, the Japanese Naval Air Force continued what it called the Great Air Battle of Bougainville, and sent airstrikes over the island almost every day. The pilots returned with extravagant claims of damage done, as was becoming usual. The major land defense effort of the Japanese in December came midway through the month. The United States Marines wanted to consolidate their line north of the east-west trail, and they found a Japanese strongpoint on a ridge north of the position of the 21st Marines. It turned out to be a natural fortress, about 300 yards long, with two almost vertical sides and a narrow and highly defensible crest about 40 yards wide. It was all heavy jungle. Needless to say, the Japanese had done the best they could with the terrain at hand. The ridge was occupied by a reinforced company of Colonel Hamanue's 23rd Infantry Regiment. They had done something that the Marines would find new. They treated their position as an island and defended it on all sides. Thus, there was no tender spot at the rear, which could be outflanked. Of course, this sort of defence presupposed willingness to fight to the last man. That was becoming a cornerstone of Japanese defence in this war. Not many of the Allies involved in the South Pacific had any direct information about what had occurred at Tarawa late in November, so they were not quite sure what to expect. On December 12, the Marines began their assault on this position, which they quickly named Hellzapoppin Ridge, after an Olsen and Johnson vaudeville show then popular back home. The ridge lived up to its gaudy name, producing more fireworks than any other Japanese position on this island. During the lull of late November, the Japanese, probably advised by Colonel Hamanue, had brought up a considerable amount of artillery to this point. The battle lasted for 6 days, and the Marines fought for every foot of the terrain. The Japanese defences were so well concealed that the Marines did not find them until they stepped into them, and by that time it meant bursts of fire and casualties. The Marines used every weapon at their disposal. They tried 60mm mortars, but these turned out to be too small. They switched to 81mm mortars, but these were only of limited effectiveness against the dug-in positions. They turned on the artillery, but it was not very effective against reverse hill positions. They called for air support, but it too had serious limitations against defences in dugouts. Finally, after 5 days of heartbreaking fighting, the Marines utilised everything at once. They called for 3 airstrikes, an artillery barrage, and then a 4th airstrike, and they got them all. Then troops of the 1st and 3rd Battalions of the 21st Marines moved forward on 2 sides of the hill and up, squeezing the Japanese like one squeezes an orange. Under this pressure, the Japanese troops moved upward and out of their dugouts and foxholes, and they were pushed off their hill. When the battle was over and the Marines held the position, they had 12 men killed and 23 wounded. They counted about 50 Japanese bodies. The next Japanese position that had to be eliminated was Hill 600A, another high point not far from Hellzapoppin Ridge, from which the Japanese were shelling supply dumps in the area with 75mm guns and 90mm mortars. The battle began on December 21, and for 2 days this attack languished, in the face of determined Japanese resistance and the usual carefully built defensive positions. On December 23, the Marines called up a heavy artillery barrage, but even this did not do the job. The infantry that attacked after the barrage was again repulsed by heavy machine gun fire from concealed positions along the hill. But what the artillery did do, once again, was convince the Japanese that their hours on the hill were numbered, and on the night of December 23 they pulled out. On Christmas Eve, when the Marines moved up, they found a Christmas present: Hill 600A, abandoned by the enemy. They found 25 prepared positions on the hill and 1 dead Japanese soldier. After the Allied capture of Hill 600A and Hellzapoppin Ridge, once again the fighting died down. The Marines held their perimeter, and the work on the upper airfields continued. On December 10, Marine Squadron VMF 216 had begun operations from the lower airfield. 10 days later, the Army 339th Fighter Squadron and the 347th Fighter Group began operations from the new airstrip built on Sterling Island in the Treasury Group. Part of the Army's 69th Bombardment Squadron moved up to the Treasuries as well. Soon 3 Army heavy bomber squadrons were operating from Munda. It would not be long before the 2 upper strips were ready at Bougainville. During December, Major General Oscar Griswold of the Army 14th Corps took over the defence of the perimeter from General Geiger. The Marines began to move out to the beach and into transports. On December 28, Major General John R. Hodge, commander of the American Division, took over the active eastern front of the island from the 3rd Marine Division. The assault phase of the invasion of Bougainville was officially over. General Griswold's job was to hold the perimeter and protect the airfields, and one reason the Japanese generals were so loath to undertake activity on Bougainville was the nature of the island. There were virtually no roads, save those the Japanese had built around their major bases. A movement north from Boin meant that the troops either had to take Colonel Hamanoue's crocodile route or come up along the seacoast. Since the Japanese Navy would not commit destroyers for this activity, the army had only its own resources, and that meant the Daihatsu barges. There were hundreds of them in the area, but they were lightly armed and no match for anything larger than PT boats. By this time, a number of United States destroyer squadrons were ranging all over these waters, looking for trouble and not finding it often enough to suit them. There was also another problem. The army's sailors were not such good navigators. Thus, although many Daihatsus were dispatched around the island, they had a tendency to get lost when they were not attacked. It was not a very satisfactory system of troop movement. Yet at the end of December 1943, General Imamura of the 8th Area Army finally realized that the Americans were dug in around Torokina and that they apparently were not going to move elsewhere in Bougainville. This meant that they were now capable of assaulting Rabaul as they liked. The occasion for this change of heart was the assault by General MacArthur's Southwest Pacific forces on New Britain Island's Cape Gloucester. Since Cape Gloucester was on the same island that housed Rabaul, although at the other end of the heavily jungled island, the Japanese had to begin to rethink their entire South Pacific strategy. Next came Southwest Pacific moves that cut off Dampier Strait as a usable waterway, and it was soon apparent to General Imamura that the Allies were bent on surrounding Rabaul. They were coming too close. Therefore he ordered General Hyakutake to prepare a battle plan and be ready to carry it out within the next 2 months. Its objective would be to drive the Americans from Bougainville and put an end to the American air superiority that was developing in the South Pacific. At that point, General Hyakutake moved to act. The Japanese 17th Army and its supporting forces numbered about 44,000 troops. Many of these were in and around Boin, but some were as far away as Choiseul, and another 10,000 troops were stationed in the north around Buka. The Japanese Navy, with its Shortlands and Boin bases, had some 20,000 personnel in southern Bougainville, ranging from pilots to Special Landing Corps units, Marines. The southern Bougainville base also controlled units on Choiseul, so when the Japanese decided it was time to do something about the Americans in the middle of their Bougainville Island base, they had the troops. Hyakutake spent the next few weeks planning the assault that should have come in November. He detailed General Kanda's 6th Division to lead the attack. Altogether 12,000 troops would be employed, with another 3,000 in reserve. They would make the arduous overland trek along the trails, and they would take plenty of artillery. This was the plan. So important had it become suddenly that on January 21, General Imamura bestirred himself to make the arduous and dangerous journey to Bougainville to confer with General Hyakutake and see the 17th Army's battle plan for himself. He came, he saw, he put his stamp of approval on the plan. Furthermore, Imperial General Headquarters did the same. The reason it was going to take 3 months to get into action was that Imamura and Hyakutake had so far underestimated the power of motion of the Allies that they had relaxed combat training. Now they felt the need for at least a month of training and preparation before the men would be ready to go into battle. The urgency of the Japanese situation was made even more grim on January 31, when suddenly out of the blue, it seemed, some 300 troops of the New Zealand 30th Division landed on Green Island and remained there for 24 hours. During this period, they scouted some good landing beaches and a site for an airfield. Green Island lies northwest of Buka Island, and it is 117 miles directly east of Rabaul. The Japanese had no particular use for the island, except as a barge staging area and port of refuge, but in Allied hands it would be another link in the steel chain that was tightening around Rabaul. Sure enough, less than 3 weeks later, Halsey ordered troops landed on Green Island. About 5,800 New Zealanders landed and quickly wiped out a 70-man Japanese garrison. Then the Seabees came in and began building an airstrip, and by March 7, the day the Japanese attack against the Torokina bridgehead was to begin, the airstrip was completed and ready for traffic. The noose was tightening around Rabaul, and Admiral Halsey and General Griswold knew that the Japanese would have to try something to relieve the pressure. As for the Americans, they now had around 27,000 combat troops on Bougainville. They included the Army 37th Division, General Hodges' Americal Division, and the 3rd Marine Defense Battalion. But General Griswold would also have the services of the Solomons Air Force, now operating out of Bougainville Strips 2, and a destroyer fleet on which to call for fire support. The Japanese had no naval support at all, and no air support that would do them any good, even if Rabaul were able to move planes down to fight. The problem was that by March 1944, Rabaul was getting pasted so often that the number of planes was decreasing sharply, and many key personnel were already being evacuated from New Britain Island. So General Hyakutake was about to fight in March that much delayed battle for Bougainville, but it was under far less salutary conditions for his troops than had existed 4 months earlier. As the two sides prepared, Halsey did his best to interdict supply movement to Bougainville and movement around the islands, but this campaign was not particularly successful since the Japanese were using the elusive Daihatsu landing craft. The presence of 4 different squadrons of destroyers, ranging around Bougainville, did keep the Japanese from managing any resupply missions, not that they were really needed. The Japanese had plenty of troops and plenty of guns and ammunition on Bougainville. What they did not have was air and sea control. The air bases at Buka and Buin were kept under surveillance by the Allies and were bombed, bombarded and strafed regularly. The troops were in movement early in March, and 3 main assault points around the upper perimeter were chosen by the 6th Division as keys to the battle. The Japanese also brought in as much artillery as they could to place on the heights overlooking the battle area. One column of Japanese, the Iwasa detachment, would approach along the Numa Trail and attack from the northwest against the height the Japanese called Hill 800 and the Americans called Hill 700. Another, the Muta detachment, would attack from the north against Hill 600. The third, the Shinkata Shibu, would attack from the east. Their objectives were the upper airstrips. Once those were taken, they would move down to the coast and wipe out the coastal airstrip and drive the Americans into the sea. The attack began on March 8 with a simultaneous Japanese bombardment of the lower airstrip and the movement of the 13th Japanese Regiment's 1st Battalion. The Americans did not consider the attack of the 8th the main thrust, and by day's end, the Japanese had moved up to a position close to the American lines and were pleased to note that the attack seemed to have got off to a good start. On March 9, the Japanese attacked with enormous enthusiasm and secured a stronghold on the bottom of the height they called Hill 800, but they could not attain the top, no matter how hard they tried. As night fell, they gave up and prepared for the next day. It was the same. The Japanese reinforced the position and attacked other high points nearby, but they could not dislodge the Americans. The big difference was provided by the American planes that dropped high explosive and fragmentation bombs that did great damage to the Japanese. The 23rd Infantry was supposed to move in and make its assault that day too, but for some reason it did not. The combination of fierce American air activity and the Japanese failure took the edge off the primary attack. That night the 23rd Regiment did make an attack, and although it was pressed hard, it still did not succeed, largely because the Americans were able to call on destroyers off the Torokina coast for spot fire. Once again this was useful, not only in what it destroyed but in its effect on the Japanese troops, who had no such support. As noted, General Imamura had believed that all the columns would swing into action on the same day, and that within 48 hours the decision would be made. But as it turned out, the Muta detachment failed to get into position to make its attack on Hill 600 until March 12. This battle for the Bougainville perimeter was by far the most sophisticated encounter of the land war to date. The Americans used tanks and flamethrowers. They brought up loudspeakers to the area around Hill 800 and called on the Japanese to surrender. The Japanese answered with a hail of bullets. There was not going to be a lot of surrender here. The battle raged for nearly 3 weeks, and the story of this battle is complex enough to deserve a book of its own. Several times the issue seemed to be in doubt, but in each case the preponderance of American military power turned the scales. The stories of the Japanese are tales of deadly valor, for they literally attacked at times by coming up over the dead bodies of the comrades slaughtered in the attack before. Finally, on March 23, the Japanese launched a last desperate attempt and managed to come within a few yards of one airstrip before they were hurled back again. This was the last time. The Army's American Division and its 37th Infantry Division proved themselves to be as effective fighters as the Marines had been on Bougainville. Before the end of the month, the Japanese withdrew, exhausted. They would not again try and force to break the American line, and for good reason. Their officers had, from the beginning of the China War, instilled in the Japanese soldier the belief that his patriotism and loyalty to the imperial system made him virtually impervious to defeat, and why would it be so hard to believe? Historically, the system of the warrior class who were willing to sacrifice life for a master was very much a part of the Japanese ambience. The idea of honourable self-termination had persisted for 1,000 years, and given the belief that a death in battle guaranteed a soul's future, the Japanese did not find it hard to accept the spirit of self-sacrifice. Further, in all their history, the Japanese had never lost a foreign war. They had defeated the Chinese, the Russians, and the Germans in wars past. Since 1941, they had defeated the English, the Dutch, and the Americans. The 9,500 shock troops of 3 crack regiments had given the attack their every effort, and one had only to look at the casualty figures to prove it. The Americans claimed to have lost only 263 men killed or dead of their wounds, and listed their casualties in the hundreds. The Japanese had lost 3,000 men dead and 4,000 wounded, or about 80% of their fighting force. It was no wonder then that they had to give up the field to the victorious Americans, so Bougainville was as secure for the Americans as it would ever be. There was just one more effort to be made in tightening the belt around Rabaul. On March 20, as the Bougainville perimeter battle continued, Admiral Halsey's forces landed on Emirau Island in the St. Matthias Group, some 75 miles northwest of Cavien and 250 miles north of Cape Gloucester on New Britain. The small Japanese garrison was eliminated in a matter of hours. Then the ring around Rabaul was complete. The campaign for the Northern Solomons was not very well understood by either the Japanese or the Americans at home. After the initial landings at Cape Torokina on Bougainville, the land fighting seemed to lose direction. The war correspondents, who wanted excitement, found the Bougainville campaign too dull for them, so they left, after issuing some parting shots about Halsey's waste of time by getting bogged down in the jungle of Bougainville when he could be attacking big bases. They went off either to explore General MacArthur's well-oiled press machinery or to wait back in Pearl Harbor, where the action of the next few months would originate. The criticism of the Bougainville campaign was anything but warranted. The fact was that the struggle on New Georgia had shown how disastrous it could be to get bogged down in jungle warfare. On Bougainville, the Allies avoided that trap, and their casualties were minimal while they tied up some 70,000 Japanese troops who were certainly not going to be fighting elsewhere. After the establishment of the ring of bases around Rabaul, General Imamura and Admiral Kusaka found themselves completely cut off from the mainstream of the war. In February, the American carrier fleet had attacked Truk, the Gibraltar of the Pacific, with the result that Admiral Koga decided to remove his headquarters from that atoll and in essence declared that it was abandoned as a major base. After that happened, the fate of Rabaul was indeed sealed. No longer were aircraft brought in from the pipeline to defend the southern base. What were left were withdrawn that spring, and Rabaul became an airbase without aircraft. Once in a while, a resourceful mechanic managed to piece together enough parts to put a Zero into the air, but against the 700 planes or so of the Solomons Air Force plus the hundreds more of MacArthur's 5th Air Force, these little forays were meaningless. While Admiral Halsey was moving up the Solomon chain and General MacArthur was moving around the Papua Peninsula of New Guinea, sewing up the top of the circle around Rabaul. With the capture of the Admiralty Islands in March, the Allies not only had sealed off Rabaul, but had acquired an enormously important new base at Seadler Harbour off Manus Island. So by the 1st of April 1944, there sat General Imamura and Admiral Kusaka, and perhaps 100,000 soldiers and sailors, cut off completely from their home bases. They had no immediate problems of survival, because Imamura had laid in thousands of tons of supplies and guns and ammunition for the Port Moresby operation and other forays that never came off. However, from that point on, the only contact between the South Pacific Islands and the Japanese command was kept up through infrequent submarine missions, bringing in medical supplies and other elements of survival, and the survival rate was not as high as it might have been. Deprived of proper medical treatment and condemned to sinkholes of fever, the Japanese soldiers and sailors languished, and while there were perhaps 200,000 bypassed troops throughout the South Pacific, when the time of surrender came, only about 125,000 of them were left alive. Rabaul, Bougainville, Choiseul, and a dozen smaller island bases languished, immobile for the rest of the war. Except to defend themselves from Allied air attack, which came almost daily for the next few months, the soldiers and sailors had nothing to do but plant gardens and raise crops. For a time, General Imamura expected an Allied attack on Rabaul, and he welcomed it because his defences were strong.